My aunt called me on a Thursday afternoon, which should have been my first warning, because my aunt never calls just to talk. She always calls to instruct. The Harrington dinner is Saturday, she said, skipping hello entirely, skipping everything that normal people put at the beginning of phone calls. James's future in-laws are flying in from Seattle. Very prominent family. The father runs one of the largest architectural firms on the West Coast. She paused, and I could hear her arranging words in that particular way she had, the way a person arranges furniture before company arrives. Everything positioned to make the best impression, nothing left where it naturally fell. I need you to be appropriate, Iris. That's all I'm asking. Just be appropriate. I was 34 years old. I had been appropriate, or trying to be, for most of those 34 years. But I said, of course, and she hung up without saying goodbye, which was also normal for her. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after the call ended, staring at the wall of my apartment, which was small and not Pinterest-worthy, and located in a part of the city my aunt referred to as that neighborhood you insist on living in. I thought about what she meant by appropriate. I'd had enough years of practice to know it was a moving target. It meant don't bring up your job in a way that makes it sound unimportant, but also don't make it sound like you think you're better than everyone. It meant dress nicely, but not like you're trying too hard. It meant laugh at the right moments and don't hold your wine glass too tight, and for the love of everything, do not let on that things between you and this family are anything other than warm. Things between me and this family were not warm. Not cold either, exactly. More like the temperature of a room that no one had been in for a long time. My uncle had died 4 years earlier, which had reshuffled everything in ways that nobody ever talked about directly. My aunt had stepped into the space he'd left and expanded to fill it, and somewhere in that expansion I had gotten quietly moved to the perimeter. My cousin James, her son, was getting married to a woman named Serena, and Serena was lovely, genuinely lovely, the kind of person who makes you feel guilty for being guarded because she hasn't given you any reason to be. But her family, her father specifically, was the kind of name my aunt said with a certain reverence that she reserved for people she considered above herself, which was a very short list. I had never met Serena's father. I knew his name was Douglas Whitmore, and that he had built his firm from a 2-person office in Portland 30 years ago into something that had designed 3 federal courthouses and a performing arts center that I had read about in a magazine once, without knowing it had any connection to my life. That was the extent of what I knew. My mother, my aunt's younger sister, had been invited to the dinner as well, and she picked me up on Saturday at 6 with that particular expression she wore to events she was nervous about, which was a smile slightly too wide and a way of talking that was slightly too fast. She hugged me at the door, looked me up and down in my burgundy wrap dress, and said, "You look nice," with just enough pause before the nice that I understood she'd considered other words first. In the car, she told me to let my aunt lead the conversation. She told me not to mention that I'd changed jobs last spring. She told me the Whitmore family were Presbyterians, and to keep that in mind, which I wasn't entirely sure what to do with but nodded anyway. By the time we pulled up to the restaurant, a private dining room at a place in River North that my aunt had reserved months in advance, the kind of place where the menus don't have prices, I had been thoroughly briefed on how to be a smaller version of myself for the next 3 hours. The dining room had cream walls and warm light and a long rectangular table set for 14. My aunt was already there, standing near the head of the table in a dress that said I have spent money on this without saying so explicitly. She greeted my mother with both hands and greeted me with a look that was a full sentence. Remember what we talked about? James was there with Serena, who crossed the room to hug me like she meant it. I liked Serena. I wanted to like her more than I allowed myself to, because I wasn't sure yet what the rules were for how much I was allowed to have in this family, and attachments felt risky when the architecture could shift without notice. Serena's mother, a woman named Patricia, and I remembered her name because she introduced herself 3 times in the first 5 minutes, each time to a different person, with the same exact phrasing, like a recording, was warm and a little breathless, and seemed genuinely excited about everything. She complimented the restaurant. She complimented the centerpiece. She complimented my dress with the specificity of someone who actually noticed things, and I felt myself relax slightly. Serena's father arrived 8 minutes after everyone else. Not late exactly, just separately, the way some people arrive who are used to rooms reorganizing themselves around them. He was tall, silver-haired, with a handshake that he gave to every person at the table individually, working the room in a methodical way that wasn't cold, but was clearly something he'd done 10,000 times. When he reached my aunt, he held her hand in both of his and said something that made her laugh. A real laugh, not the company laugh, and I watched her shoulders drop half an inch. His name was Douglas, and his voice was the kind that didn't need to compete with other sounds in a room. It just settled over everything like weather. He made his way around the table. He reached me last, or nearly last, and I extended my hand and gave him my name, and something moved across his face. Not dramatic, nothing anyone else would have caught. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a micropause in the handshake before it completed. Then it was gone, and he smiled and moved on to the person beside me, and I thought I had imagined it. I hadn't imagined it. Dinner moved the way these dinners move. Slowly at first, everyone feeling out the conversational terrain, then faster, once the wine arrived and the bread was gone and people stopped performing quite so hard. My aunt asked Douglas about the firm's current projects with the attentiveness of a student who has done the reading. He answered generously, without showing off, describing a community library project in Tucson with the same care he'd probably used describing the federal buildings. And I noticed that about him, the way he leveled the conversation, so nothing was more important than anything else. James made a toast. It was sweet and a little clumsy, the way his best speeches always were, and Serena laughed at exactly the right moments, which told me everything I needed to know about how she felt about him. My aunt dabbed her eye with a napkin, and my mother reached over and squeezed her hand. For a few minutes I let myself just be there. Not performing, not monitoring, just a person at a table where something good was happening. Then Douglas set down his wine glass. He didn't stand, he didn't raise his voice. He just set the glass down in a way that had weight to it, a gesture that a room full of people somehow felt without being able to explain why, and the conversations around the table began tapering off in that organic way they do when someone with a certain kind of presence makes even a small movement. He looked down the table, past my aunt, past my cousin and his fiancée, past my mother who was mid-sentence about something and trailed off uncertainly. He looked at me, not a glance, a look, the kind with intention behind it. "I hope you'll forgive me," he said to the table in general, but his eyes still on me. "Because I've been sitting here for the last hour trying to decide whether I was right or wrong about something, and I've decided I'm right. Because I'm almost always right about faces." The table went quiet in the specific way. Tables go quiet when they don't yet know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. My aunt's hand had gone still on her water glass. Douglas tilted his head slightly, studying me with an expression that was measured and precise, the way I imagined he studied the site of a building before he decided where the door should go. "Your last name isn't Calloway," he said, because I'd introduced myself by my first name only. "But you have a brother named Miles, if I'm not mistaken, or had one." The air in the room changed temperature. "I have a brother named Miles. He died 5 years ago. He was 29 years old, and he had spent the last 3 years of his life doing urban planning and community advocacy work in a neighborhood on the south side that most of the people at that table would have locked their car doors driving through. I don't bring him up at family events because the last time I did at my uncle's birthday, my aunt had looked at me with an expression that said this is not the time and place, and I had learned to keep Miles for places where he would be received correctly. "Yes," I said. My voice was steady. I was good at steady when it mattered. "I did. He passed away in 2019. Douglas nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something he'd suspected but hadn't let himself be certain of until now. "I thought so," he said. "You have his eyes. And his name? Not his last name, I mean the way you introduced yourself." Miles always introduced himself the same way, just Miles. First name, direct eye contact, handshake. He said last names were for business cards. He paused. "He worked with my firm for 8 months on the Caldwell Street project, the mixed-income housing development on the south side. You know it?" I knew it. Miles had told me about it. He'd been so proud of it. The development that had replaced a vacant lot with 47 units, a ground-floor community center, a small urban garden that the residents managed themselves. I had driven past it once after he died, just to see it, and sat in my car outside for 20 minutes. "I know it," I said. "He was—" Douglas stopped, selected a different word than the one he'd started with. "He was the best community liaison I'd worked with in 20 years of practice. Not because he knew the spreadsheets. He knew the people. He knew every family on that block by name before the project was 3 months old. He'd show up to city council meetings on his own time and argue for details that didn't affect the budget, but affected whether people felt like the space was actually theirs. He looked at me steadily. I tried to recruit him. He said no because he didn't want a salary that moved him to a different zip code. That was a direct quote. That was a Miles quote. That was exactly a Miles quote. I pressed my thumb into the side of my index finger under the table where no one could see. It's something I do when I need to stay in my body. My aunt's face had done something complicated. She had known Miles too, obviously. He was my mother's son, my aunt's nephew, but she had always treated him the way she treated anything that didn't fit the story she was telling about our family. She would not have told Serena's parents about him. She would not have mentioned him in whatever careful pre-dinner conversations had prepared this gathering. He was edited out the way things get edited out when they complicate the presentation. He never mentioned family, Douglas said. Or he mentioned family, a mother, a sister, but not in a way that named names. Private man. Same way he was private about his work. Did it and didn't need the room to know he was doing it. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. What do you do? And here was the question. The one that had a specific gravity at this table, in this room, with my aunt sitting 9 feet away and her fingers now very deliberately set flat on the tablecloth, the way a person's fingers go flat when they are maintaining control of something. What do? I work for a nonprofit. A small one, 11 staff members, a budget that would make the people at this table raise polite eyebrows, an office in a converted storefront in the same South Side neighborhood where Miles had worked and where the Caldwell Street development stood. We do housing advocacy. We work with families facing eviction, connect them with legal resources, show up to court with them, follow the cases, track the outcomes, push the city when the outcomes are unjust. I've been doing it for 6 years, since before Miles died, since before I understood that what I was doing had anything to do with what he was doing, and then after he died I understood that we had both arrived at the same place from different directions without ever quite comparing notes. It is not a job my aunt has ever asked me about. It is not a job that impresses people at dinners in River North. It does not come with a title that makes rooms lean in. I work in housing advocacy, I said. Southside. I run the legal support program at an organization called the Meridian Housing Coalition. The sentence landed. My aunt's wineglass moved slightly, just slightly, because her hand had tightened around it. My mother looked at me, and then at Douglas, and then at her plate. Douglas's expression didn't change. It didn't need to, because it had already settled into something that was past changing. Meridian, he said. On 43rd, yes. You know a woman named Carmen Reyes. She runs the tenant organizing arm. Carmen's been with us for 4 years. She's one of our best. She testified at a zoning hearing last fall. For a client of ours, a building owner who was trying to do right by long-term tenants during a sale. She came in with documentation that the city hadn't required and wouldn't have asked for, and that documentation changed the terms of what we were able to offer those families. He picked up his wine glass again. I've been trying to figure out who trained her to work that way. I had trained her to work that way. Not alone. She'd come to us already sharp, already committed, but the documentation protocols were something I'd built over 3 years of watching what worked in front of judges and what didn't. And Carmen had walked into the organization and learned them faster than anyone I'd ever worked with. I helped develop the process, I said. Carmen made it better. Douglas looked at me for a long moment. The string quartet in the corner. There was a string quartet because of course there was, in the corner near the window, had shifted between pieces, and in the space between one song ending and another beginning, the silence at the table was the loudest thing in the room. My aunt opened her mouth. I wasn't sure what she was going to say. Something navigating, something that redirected, something that acknowledged without elevating. She was skilled at all of those. But Douglas spoke first, and he didn't look away from me when he did. I want to make a small addition to the toast James already made, he said, at a volume the whole table could hear without him raising his voice at all, because I've just realized I'm having dinner with someone whose organization I've cited in 2 grant proposals and a brief to the Chicago Planning Department, without ever knowing I was citing her work. He paused. That's a meaningful thing to discover, especially here. He raised his glass. The table raised theirs, a little uncertain about the shape of what was happening, but following the lead of a man who clearly knew where he was going. My mother's eyes were bright. My aunt raised her glass too. She had to. The room had decided, and she was a part of the room, and I raised mine because I didn't need to make a point. The point had already been made, and not by me, which was the thing about it that felt the most like justice. Quiet and complete and impossible to argue with. After dinner, in the slow drift toward the coat check, my cousin James found me near the window that looked out over the street. He had this expression I hadn't seen on him in years, something open and a little undone, like something had been moved and he wasn't sure yet if it was supposed to be moved. "Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. I thought about the true answer, which was layered and complicated and probably deserved more than a restaurant entryway. I thought about all the dinners where I'd felt the careful editing, the sense that the version of me allowed in the room had a lower ceiling than the one that existed in the rest of my life. I thought about Miles, who had done the same thing, who had kept his work separate from family events because he knew what happened when you brought things that didn't fit the frame. There wasn't a lot of room for it, I said, in the version of me that got brought to these things. He looked at that for a moment, nodded the way someone nods when they're not nodding in agreement exactly, but in recognition, like they're acknowledging that a thing exists even if they don't fully know yet what to do with it. "I'm sorry," he said, I don't know. For not asking. You could start now," I said, and he almost smiled, the almost smile that had been his since we were kids, the one that meant he was working up to something real. "Tell me about Meridian," he said, so I told him. Standing near the window in our coats, the dinner crowd thinning around us, the December cold visible in the glass but not yet reaching us, I told him about the organization, about the cases, about what it looked like when someone walked into our office holding an eviction notice with 5 days left on it, and what it looked like 90 days later when they were still in their home. I told him about Carmen. I told him about Miles, things he maybe half knew, but had never heard the whole shape of. I told him that Miles and I used to meet for coffee on Sunday mornings and argue about methodology, and I hadn't had good coffee on Sundays since he died. James listened. He actually listened. My aunt found me near the coat check just before I left. Her composure was fully intact. She was too skilled at this for anything else, but there was something around the edges of it that had the texture of something recently repaired. She looked at me the way you look at something when you're calculating how much you underestimated it and don't want to acknowledge the number. "You should have told me," she said. "If I'd known the connection, if I'd known what you did, I would have introduced you differently." I looked at her for a moment. I thought about all the versions of that sentence and what they had in common. "I know," I said. She waited for more. There wasn't more. "Good night," I said, and I meant it, and I walked out through the door and into the cold, and stood on the sidewalk for a second, breathing the winter air that smelled like exhaust in the lake, and a little bit like snow that hadn't fallen yet. The city was doing its Saturday night thing all around me, indifferent and enormous, and not particularly interested in what had just happened in a private dining room on the 14th floor. I thought about Miles. I thought about the 47 units on Caldwell Street, the community garden in the back, the families who had keys to those doors. I thought about how Miles had gone to city council meetings on his own time and hadn't needed anyone at a family dinner to know about it. I thought about how the work doesn't require the acknowledgement to be real. It just requires you to keep doing it, in whatever neighborhood you've chosen, for whatever families are waiting. But I also thought about how it felt to have someone say the name of what you'd built in a room full of people who'd spent years looking past you. It felt like windows in a building that had always had the bones for them, finally being put in. I walked to my car. I drove home through the South Side, taking the long way, past 43rd Street, past the Meridian office with its lights off and its door locked, and its files full of cases that needed work on Monday. Past Caldwell Street, where the windows of 47 units were lit in the dark like a small specific argument that things can be different if enough people refuse to accept that they can't. I thought Miles would have hated the restaurant. I thought Miles would have loved the ending. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, and it was the most peaceful 30 minutes I'd spent in a year.